Soy Lorenzo Scott y junto a Mari Carmen Vaz pues hemos ayudado a coordinar el simposio de género y voy a hacer una breve introducción, muy breve. Fíjate, ASEPEL es una asociación que promueve los estudios de investigación en la economía aplicada. ¿Y por qué tener un simposio de género? Pues porque la economía es una ciencia social y como ciencia social pues intentamos estudiar el comportamiento de los agentes económicos como miembros de la sociedad. A nivel macroeconómico pues nos preguntamos, pues como esta mañana, ¿no?, como el tipo de interés natural, la inflación, el crecimiento económico. A nivel micro intentamos entender el comportamiento de los diferentes agentes, su sistema de preferencias, sus incentivos. Nos preguntamos cosas como, por ejemplo, por qué algunas personas por su hora de trabajo ganamos mucho dinero y otras personas ganáis muy poco. ¿Por qué esas diferencias salariales? Y la respuesta que se da normalmente en la economía es básicamente una diferencia de capital humano, de formación, de experiencia, es decir, una diferencia de productividad. Esa es la respuesta tradicional. Sin embargo, lo que observamos es que las brechas entre las remuneraciones que reciben diferentes agentes no responde exclusivamente a diferencias de productividad. Existen algún tipo de factores adicionales que tienen que estar detrás de esas diferencias. Factores que seguramente tienen que ver con el hecho de que somos una ciencia social y hay que incorporar factores como los roles sociales que vamos incorporando y que están condicionando nuestra capacidad de agencia. En temas de género, simplemente por el hecho de ser varón o ser mujer, tenemos una serie de ventajas o de barreras que dificultan esa igualdad de oportunidades. Y a eso se dedica la economía de género. Entonces, aprovechando que el año pasado se dio el Premio Nobel de Economía a Claudia Goldin por temas de economía de género, pues hemos pensado que dentro de lo que es el Congreso de ASEPEL de Economía Aplicada es una muy buena oportunidad para tratar de manera específica este tema de la economía de género. De hecho, hemos tenido un eje específico sobre temas de género y hemos tenido contribuciones muy interesantes dentro de este ámbito y tenemos el gran placer, el gran privilegio de contar hoy con la presencia de Paola Profeta. La profesora Mari Carmen Vaz muy amablemente me ha cedido la oportunidad de poder presentar a Paola. Te voy a pedir disculpas porque tengo que resumir el currículum de Paola, que es muy extenso, tiene un montón de contribuciones muy relevantes. Paola Profeta yo diría que es quizás una de las principales referentes a nivel internacional dentro de la economía de género y cuento muy brevemente 4 cuestiones. Actualmente catedrática de Economía Pública y decana para la Diversidad, Inclusión, Sostenibilidad de la Universidad de Bocconi en Milán, directora del AXA Research Laboratory on Gender Equality, miembro del Consejo de Dirección del Instituto Internacional de Hacienda Pública y del Comité de Mujeres en Economía de la European Economic Association, es miembro de la Italian Society of Public Economics, colabora con el Ministerio Italiano de Igualdad de Oportunidades en varios comités y es la representante italiana en el Expert Forum European Institute for Gender Equality. Forma parte del comité editorial de revistas de alto impacto científico como Tax Public Finance, European Journal of Political Economics, entre otras. Ha sido presidenta de la European Public Choice Society y ha desarrollado su actividad científica en colaboración con diferentes instituciones de reconocido prestigio, desde la Pompeu Fabra, donde creo que tuviste el doctorado, hasta universidades como la Columbia University of New York, el Trinity College de Dublín y un largo etcétera. Como digo, la profesora Profeta es una de las principales referentes a nivel internacional en el ámbito de la economía de género y además de todas sus contribuciones científicas, también desarrolla una importante labor de divulgación en todo lo que es referente a temas de igualdad de oportunidades, igualdad de género, liderazgo femenino. Y para nosotros de verdad que es un gran placer poder contar con tu presencia, que hayas aceptado nuestra invitación. Sin más, os pido un aplauso de agradecimiento para Paola.
Gracias. Primero, muchísimas gracias por esta introducción y para invitarme. y soy muy contenta de estar aquí. De ver, hay mucha gente que se ha quedado hasta el final por esta parte del Congreso sobre temas de género. Y aquí hoy voy a hablar de gender gaps in decision making. So, voy a hablar de la brecha de género desde un punto de vista particular, o sea, desde el punto de vista de tomar decisiones importantes. No sé si tengo que hablar español o inglés, porque las slides son en inglés, o sea, si la gente, si me siguen, yo hablo inglés, pero como si no puedo hablar español, porque yo, sí, porque, pero igual si luego queréis hacer preguntas y todo esto en castellano, a mí me encanta, porque, o sea, que yo hablo, normalmente no me sale muy bien la parte técnica, porque siempre lo hacemos en inglés, pero he dado clase también en castellano. ¿Tenéis una...? Vale. Pues entonces, si no me pongo aquí, vosotros les veis allí, pero yo me pongo aquí, porque si no tenemos Venga. Okay, so I will talk about gender gaps in decision making, and okay, let me start with some data. Pues entonces, okay, so we can start with some data that obviously I think that all of you know, but just to remind you. So a few days ago, we just got the last release of the Global Gender Gap Index from the World Economic Forum, and basically we understood that, as always, no country in the world has achieved gender equality. So still there are a lot of differences between men and women, and this is true everywhere. Of course, there are countries that perform better than others, but this is a problem everywhere. So the world has closed 95.8% of the gap in health, 94.4% of the gap in education, 60.3% of the gap in economic participation and opportunities, and only 22% of the gap in politics, which means that the two main dimensions that we are interested in investigating are economic participation and politics. So why do we still observe such large gender gaps when we talk about economics? Economic participation, so means labor market, women who work. So this has to do with participation to the labor market, employment rates, gender gaps in wages, careers, the glass ceiling, etc., and politics, so political representation. And basically, my research has so far concentrated mainly on these two dimensions and their interaction. So how can we explain, or why do we still observe such large gender gaps in economic participation and in politics? Of course, countries perform differently. So there are countries that perform better than others. For example, in Europe, we know the Nordic countries perform better than Southern European countries. But in general, this is still an issue, let's say, almost everywhere with some specificities. Okay. No, this doesn't work. So let me go there. Okay. Okay, so this are data. So today I will concentrate on decision making. Okay, so I would like to concentrate because, of course, when we talk about gender gaps, we can talk about many things, and I have studied several issues in my research. Today we will concentrate on decision making, which means decisions. So people, men and women, who take decisions, who are important. So let's say at top levels. Why? Because this is particularly relevant, we will see, in terms of what they decide, in terms of the agenda, and may have important consequences also for the labor market and economic participation. Okay, so when we talk about decision making, here it is where we still observe larger gender differences. This data come from EIGE, which is the European Institute for Gender Equality. So it's the gender statistics database, last data, and this and this graph represents decision-making in politics. So one of the two dimensions that I mentioned before. And you see that basically in all countries, these are European countries, in all countries, the presence of men is much higher than the presence of women. So men are the blue bullet, and women are in yellow. And you see that 50% is 50% is here, and you have almost everywhere more men than women in terms of percentage as representatives in those decision-making positions. So in the parliament, member of the parliaments, member of the political committees, and so far and so on. Some countries are very close to 50%. For example, here we have Finland, Sweden, and Iceland. Some other countries are much farther. You look at this, so there is a huge difference between men and women. But the gap is there when they take decisions. This may have consequences on the decisions themselves that are taken, the fact that we don't have equality. Second picture is on business. I said before the two main dimensions, political empowerment, political representation, and economics. So when we look at business, these are similar data, but we look at the presence of men and women in largest listed companies as presidents, board members, board members, and employees representatives. So again, we see that we are very far from 50% in almost all countries. So men represent the majority of these positions that are decision-making positions in the business world, so in the economic part, and women are a minority everywhere, with some large differences in some countries with respect to others. So basically, this is a fact, and I would like to understand, in order to understand why do we observe these differences, we basically are going to ask several questions. So the first question is how we can increase women's representation in decision making. So we have observed that there is a gender gap, that women are underrepresented. What we can do in terms of policies, in terms of measures to have better representation. And basically there are three groups of initiatives that have been considered and largely studied by many authors. For example, when we look at top positions, decision-making positions, there's been a lot of attention to the inclusion of gender quotas. We discussed this briefly also before during lunch. I have studied the introduction of gender quotas in several contexts, in particular in the business, so like board gender quotas, but also gender quotas, for example, in politics, that they are very important in order to have more women as candidate list, in the candidate list, and therefore also as elected. So gender quotas are a first measure. Of course, they are very controversial because there are people that are in favor and people that are against. And the usual comment, or let's say the usual problem, the conventional wisdom is that gender quotas may be a good way to increase women's representation, but may have also negative effects. For example, on the quality of representatives, so in qualification of representatives, and therefore in terms of performance, etc. Recent studies, and I have also contributed to this literature, show that actually this is not necessarily the case, because if the initial status quo is not, let's say, meritocratic, which is often the case when you have women represented, for example, at less than 10%, so it means that there are problems in the initial status quo. In this case, having quotas may even be beneficial for the qualification of representatives, because it means changing the status quo and having more competition and, let's say, also more merit. So this is a first idea. Second type of policies or second type of interventions relate to policies that promote the female pipeline. So, of course, quotas means that we address only the top, the decision-making positions, but really the top. For example, boards, if we are talking about the economic sector or the corporate sector, or parties, if we are talking about politics. But what happens in the rest of the economy? In the rest of the economy, of course, it's not necessarily true that if we impose quotas on the top, there will be better conditions for women in the labor market in terms of wages, in terms of careers, etc. So basically, this type of policies do not solve the problem of having more women in, let's say, in a pipeline, and therefore in terms of labor market, in terms of wages, in terms of career. So we need other policies also in order to support the entry of women into the labor market and their development during their career. For example, in particular events such as when they have children. So we know that the child penalty is still very large in many countries, especially in European countries. So women stop working when they have the first child or start earning much less, and therefore there, of course, quotas do not solve this problem. In this case, you need other type of policies. For example, equal maternity and paternity leaves, or, for example, more services for women who have children, and so far and so on. So this is the second set of interventions. And the third one, which of course is related to everything, is that we need to remove stereotypes. Why? Because basically, when we talk about gender gaps, at the end, it is always a problem of culture. It is always a matter of how, of gender norms, of gender roles, of culture in our societies, in our companies, in our firms. So basically, if we were able to remove the stereotypes related to gender norms and gender roles, of course, that would help in having better outcomes on the labor market. Of course, it's not very easy. It's actually very, very complicated to remove stereotypes because many of them are not explicit, are also implicit. We were born and we are nurtured during our entire life with these stereotypes, and many people have stereotypes that they don't even know that they have, because basically this is what prejudice and stereotypes are. So it's particularly difficult. I have worked also on this, so we can talk about that also later on. And I have done several research also on the role of gender norms, gender roles, and the stereotypes. We know that this critically affect the outcomes in terms of segregation on the labor market, discrimination on the labor market, underrepresentation of women. What is much more difficult is to see how we can intervene and remove them. So these are like three groups of things that are particularly relevant or maybe important if we want to reach the outcome. The second question is why. So if the first question is, okay, we know that there are gender gaps because we have seen the data, and we know that we can try to think about solution on how to fix them. And mainly I have worked a lot with these solutions or policies or way to fix the gender gaps because this is my area of research and what I'm more interested in. But obviously, the other question is, why do we want to do this? Because if it's the natural way, or we as economists are used to think about preferences, about individuals' preferences, etc. So we should ask, why do we want to change what we observe? If this is the result of our free choices or our free preferences, so basically that would remain. And obviously, this is not the case because actually what we observe is the result of discrimination and a lot of obstacles, and the glass ceiling itself is not the result of individual preferences or in a context without constraint. So why do we care? We care when we talk about decision-making positions. We basically care because of the following reasons, okay? So while when we talk about access to the labor market, we care because it's discrimination, because we need to guarantee equal opportunities to everybody depending on their talent and depending on their value and not on the obstacles that we encounter. When we talk about decision-making positions, we care because of the following reasons. First of all, there is a matter of equal representation. Of course, women represent 50% of the population, more or less, in all countries, and therefore we would like them to be represented in the same way also in the top positions, in decision-making positions, just as a matter of, let's say, democracy or equal representation. So that's an easy argument. And that is called the descriptive representation. But more importantly, there is an issue of substantial representation. Okay, so when we talk, for example, about politics, we know that it's not only a matter of numbers. So it's not only a matter of equal representation, of descriptive representation. It may also be a matter of what they decide, what they do, what they propose, and therefore it can go into substantial representation. And we are going to discuss this later on. The second outcome is related to the quality and selection effect. This is particularly interesting. I have investigated this a lot, both in the context of politicians and in the context of boards, so firms. And basically here, the argument is very simple from a theoretical point of view. The argument is that we have talents that are equally distributed in our populations between men and women, and we have, let's say, now more women that are more educated than men, almost in all developed countries. We are talking about developed countries. And basically, if we exclude women from the decision-making positions, we are wasting something. We are wasting in terms of economic returns, in terms of efficiency, not only in terms of equality. Why? Because they may be qualified, these people are qualified, the people are competent, these people know what to do, but if they are excluded only because of discrimination, basically the final outcome will not be the best one in terms of efficiency. So it's the usual story that the first woman is typically better than the last man. Okay, so if we enlarge a little bit the competition and include women, probably the outcome will be better. And in fact, when we talk about quotas in this context, quotas have been defined the crisis of the mediocre man. Okay, so the idea that in many contexts, quotas may be good for the final outcome or performance because basically we get rid of the mediocre man by including better women. And so this is related to the business case for diversity. So the idea that, of course, if we improve the quality and therefore if we improve the qualification, etc., also the performance will be better. Of course, better people decide better, and so the outcome will be better. Of course, this doesn't mean that we get rid of all men and we have only women in decision-making positions. It's the balance and the diversity that makes the difference. But typically, a good mix, so enlarging to women may be beneficial. Oh, sorry. I am working, but okay. Then there are two other arguments. One is related to the style of leadership. So here also there is a lot of literature that tries to understand that women and men may decide differently when they are in decision-making positions because they have a different style of leadership, because women are more risk-averse, because women are more oriented to the future, or many other traits that have received support by the literature. And finally, there is the agenda. Of course, if men and women are different in terms of substantial representation, it means that they make different decisions. And so it may be good to have both men and women, because otherwise some outcomes will never be introduced in the agenda of decision making. So this is an important point. So all these things will come out then in the example that I am going to provide you based on a recent contribution on which I am working. So these are main arguments that have been discussed in the literature. There are many papers that try to find evidence, robust evidence to this. And I think it's important for us to understand why we want to study this type of issues and why it matters. Okay, so what's the problem here? The major problem when we try to address this in economics and in our studies, The major problem, of course, has to do with the endogeneity problem. Why? Because it's very difficult to test a causal link. It's very difficult to identify causality from the presence of women in leadership positions to the different outcomes. Of course, we never know if firms that have more, let's say, more women on boards or in decision-making positions perform better because these women lead the performance, or because the other way around. It may be that firms that perform better decide to appoint more women. So this is the classical endogeneity problem that we should try to solve as researchers, because otherwise we end up with the usual, let's say, descriptive argument or descriptive research of many non-academic institutions that always say, if you are a little bit familiar with this, very, very often we hear, okay, you appoint one woman and your profits will raise by 10%. That's obviously quite difficult to believe, or it would be very easy or very good, but it's very difficult. Why? Because this is completely endogenous. We need to understand whether there is a link because it's a causal link or a simple correlation. And of course, this is very difficult, but this is why we as academics are talking about these topics. So, speaking about decision-making positions, we now have several ways to exploit the effects of, to understand the causal link. For example, because we exploit the introduction of exogenous variations, and this is also why the quotas are very interesting in this context. So why? Because quotas means that we have more women in those decision-making positions because there is a what is this? Because there is a law that imposed quotas, and not because the firms was going better or worse or whatever. So it's an exogenous variation. So this is good for us as researchers. And we can have the usual policy evaluation of the effectiveness of this measure and use different methods of analysis. Obviously, it would be much better, or let's say it would be perfect, if we could have randomized controlled trial experiments. But basically, these are almost impossible in this context because especially in developed countries, it is very difficult to say, okay, now I have like in one group in a sample, I take one group and I put a woman on top of this firm and I put a man on top of the other, and they are completely equal and they are completely comparable, and I see what happens. I mean, this natural randomized experiment are very difficult, and also what we could do is almost impossible. So we have to turn around and try to find other ways to identify the problem. Okay, so now I'm going to focus. So given this, let's say, overview about the topics, which is women in decision-making positions and why and how it matters for us, I'm going to focus on women in leadership positions in politics, and I'm going to present you a recent paper that we are working on, so that you can also, let's say, make your comments. So basically, when we talk about women leadership in politics, but it's very similar in business. I mean, the idea is really goes in parallel. The question is, once elected, do male and female politicians make different decisions, or they just doesn't matter, they do the same? And basically, the decision that we are going to look at is the decision on the size and allocation of public spending. In particular, is it true that women spend more than men in childcare, education, family expenditure? So if we look at data, and if you look at simple correlation and simple cross-country regressions, that seems to be true. So that this correlation is confirmed. So countries where there are more women in parliament, where there are more women in decision-making positions, tend to spend more, for example, in childcare, in education, in family expenditures, that are things that at the end are good for women, so good for the labor market. So it reinforces the reduction of gender gaps. So basically, we have a channel going, a political economy channel going from women in top decision-making positions to the policies that at the end may reduce gender gaps in the labor market. So at the end, it may be particularly good. However, if we want to understand whether there is a causal relationship, this becomes very much more problematic because of the endogeneity problem. We don't know if there are more women because in these positions, because they decide a different allocation of spending, more childcare, for example, or because in a country or in a place there is more childcare expenditure, therefore this allows women to work more. Can be the case. And they work more and they also do more activities in politics. That can also be a possibility. Or an alternative explanation, of course, if there is an exogenous variable, like our culture, gender norms, gender roles. Gender norms are more progressive, there is more egalitarian rules in terms of gender culture, and therefore in this place there are more women in decision-making positions and at the same time more childcare, family expenditure, etc. How can we disentangle this? Of course, this is important to understand exactly the mechanisms and the link, because otherwise we may end up doing very unpredictable outcome or policy recommendations. We may end up saying, okay, let's appoint more women, and then we don't know what happens. So it's particularly relevant, okay? For example, times of the introduction of gender quotas, that was an issue, because we may end up with a recommendation saying, okay, the gender quotas are recommended or maybe particularly good for having some outcomes in terms of firms' performance, etc., but we really don't know if this is true or not. So it is important to understand if the links are causal or not. Okay, so there's abundant literature in this, of course. This is not something that I am doing for the first time. So when we look at female policymakers, many papers suggest that they prefer a larger size of public spending, more, and also a different allocation of items. For example, spending more in health, social spending, and education. There is a recent review paper, if you are not familiar with this literature, by Hessami and Da Fonseca, which basically puts all these things together and also try to disentangle which papers are causal and which are not. And there are many other papers that I just mentioned here. There is also the old story that basically women prefer a larger government, because typically they are poorer in the population because of the gender wage gap, because women earn less than men, and if they are let's say the poorer part of the population, then to prefer a larger government, and thus is an argument which was proved by papers that identified the effect by looking at the date of the enfranchisement of women. So when women started to vote, which obviously happened in different times in different countries. And the enfranchisement of women is positively related to the expansion of the welfare state. Okay, so women also may have a particular way of doing politics or different political styles. So what I said before in terms of leadership may have clear examples when we look at politicians. For example, there are papers that suggest that female politicians are more collaborative, inclusive, sensitive to other needs. They have lower rate of absenteeism. They are less conflictual, more cooperative. They seek solution rather than create disputes. They are more honest, less corrupted. I mean, there are a lot of papers in that direction that have been performed in the past. So it's not only a matter of agenda, substantial representation, it's also a matter of leadership style, if we, let's say, consider this type of dimensions more related to the leadership style, as I said before, in decision making. Okay, so recent research has focused on the COVID pandemic. The COVID, female leaders, for example, you may have heard that there was a difference in how the pandemic was addressed by men and women. And basically, we have several papers that suggest that female leaders fostered more non-pharmaceutical interventions, reducing deaths, or had a different type of reaction to the COVID pandemic. And also, there was this narrative that, let's say, women leaders were better than men leaders during the pandemic. for several reasons related to the intervention, but also, for example, to school closure or to different intellectual incentives. And also another, for example, there was also different style of leadership in terms of communication, in terms of interaction, information with voters, etc. So those things somehow have been studied by recent papers. So what we do in this paper is we try to put all these things together and understand whether we have observed, let's say, different in terms of childcare. So childcare is typically the clear female issue, let's say, something which obviously it has not to do only with women, because of course it's something for children, for their development, etc. But childcare for me, in terms of in the usual narrative, is associated with women. It's a female issue. Why? Because if there is a good service in terms of childcare, therefore women can go working. If there is a good attention to children, therefore this is good also for the family, etc. So we know that childcare is something somehow associated with women. And we also know from previous papers that childcare is typically associated with maternal employment. So when there is a good availability of services and childcare, women tend to work more. Is this good? Is this bad? I don't know. But there is this, let's say, positive relationship. So the question becomes, is this different if we have female or male political leaders? This is important. Why? Because it's an example of substantive representation. And we use the idea of the COVID because in that period, the childcare became particularly relevant because many schools were closed for a long time, and therefore who was going to take care of the children became a particularly important question. Okay, so what we do more exactly in this research. This is joint paper with two people who worked with me at this gender lab that I founded at Bocconi University, Alda Marchesi and Giulia Savio. We basically look at the Italian context, but of course you can do also in another case because we had good data for the Italian context. We look at small Italian municipalities, so under 5,000. I continue. Okay. Under 5,000 inhabitants, so very small places where basically the politicians are quite close to people, to voters. And we analyze childcare expenditures. Childcare expenditure are decided at the local level, so at the municipality level. And we try to understand whether there is a difference between male and female mayors in these small municipalities, looking at before, during, and post-COVID. And in a nutshell, what we try to see is whether the impact of the pandemic is different between men and women. We know that the pandemic was particularly relevant for childcare expenditure. And and we do several things. In order to identify the causal link, we are going to use a difference in discontinuity design. Basically here, we are going to use mixed gender races among Italian majors. So this is a technique which is typically used. You look at municipalities, you look at close races. So basically the mayor is a man or a woman, but it turns out to be a man or a woman, but elected in a close race with a man against a woman. So you look at municipalities where the two final opponents were a man and a woman for becoming a mayor, and this man and a woman went into a very close race, and so one of the two, of course, end up being the winner, but for a very small margin. And this means that we can approximate the gender of the mayor is as random. Okay, because they ended up, this is not something that I introduced, of course, it's very used in the literature, but it's one of the ways to identify the effect. Because if the gender is random, so you happen to be a male mayor or a female mayor randomly, Then we can look at what they do in terms of the policy, in terms of the outcomes, in terms of their decision, and therefore we have established a causal link without having the endogeneity problem because the gender was just random. So that's the idea. So we will look at this mixed gender races among Italian majors, and we exploit time variation, and we look at the period before, so the before period, before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, and I will not anticipate the result, so let me tell you what we see. Okay, so this graph basically shows you the main results. So you see here, starting from 2017, we started to collect data, and this is the expenditure in childcare for in municipalities that are run by a female mayor, the red one, and the municipalities that are run by a male mayor, those are the black. And basically, you see that before COVID, there is the substantive representation story. So women spend more into childcare with respect to men. Okay, so there is the idea that, so we confirm the hypothesis of substantive representation that when we have women, it's not only a matter of who they are, but also what they do. So they tend to spend more into childcare with respect to men. Why? Because childcare is a female issue, and so all the literature that we know also from the past. So we can confirm this idea. But this changes dramatically during the COVID. So what happened here? During the COVID, the schools were closed, the people were looking at childcare as something very important, salient for families, much more than before. And basically what we saw is that males started to increase childcare, and women also increased, but less than men. And basically at the end, they became almost equal. So what we are going to describe is this dynamic, which was created by an emergency, by a crisis, which is the pandemic in this case, but it may happen also with other crises. And that tells you that this substantive representation story disappears while we have an emergency, while we have a crisis, as in this case. And actually, at the end, men and women do exactly the same. But they do exactly the same because men realize that childcare is important, because probably voters realize that childcare is important. So they tend to go into this situation. Of course, this is a graph just as average municipalities. We want to be very precise, so we want to identify the causal impact. So we are going to look at the close races as I anticipated before. This is for everybody. Okay, so if you don't know anything about the Italian context, it's not particularly relevant, but just to tell you that it's interesting because we have elections every 5 years. We are talking about municipalities, of the mayor. We have the mayor, we have the municipal council, we have the executive council, and the mayor is particularly important in these small municipalities because they take elections and actually they are voted directly, okay? In the small municipalities. Then we collect data from the balance sheet of the municipalities. Of course, we have all the expenditures of the municipality in terms of balance sheet, final balance sheet, and the current account, capital account for all categories of expenditures. And this is obviously what we want to understand. So, as I told you, we are going to look at close elections between male and female mayor candidates in this period of time. And we are going to concentrate on small municipalities because with these small municipalities, they basically vote in the same way, direct election of the mayor. They don't have quotas and they don't have the system of the double preference voting, which I have investigated in another paper. Larger municipalities in Italy, when they elect, when there are elections, individuals can vote, can express up to 2 preferences if one is a man and one is a woman for municipal councillors. So we wanted to, this may increase the preference for female majors. So we want to eliminate this. We exclude the first year of a retro cycle because, you know, there is also the story of the political budget cycle, so that at the beginning, that politicians are affected by the cycle. So at the end, this is our period of time. And we have an unbalanced data set for the pre and post period, COVID period, but we also check that the results are robust using a balanced data set. We end up with a little bit more than 1,000 municipalities. In Italy, we have 8,000. So basically, this is good to do this type of analysis because we have some power. So we end up with a little bit more than 1,000 that they are divided between north and south in all the regions, etc. Okay. Data from the election come from the Ministry of Domestic Affairs. We basically know everything about these elections: the year, the turnout, the major characteristics, so the gender, the age, education, if there is an incumbent, the number of votes, the candidate list. We also know the social demographic characteristics of the municipality, and we have this balance sheet data, as I told you before. Okay, for our deviation assumption, we need the following. We need to check the following. Of course, the first one is the continuity in the density of the municipalities around the cutoff. So basically, the so-called McCrary test that I don't know if I can do this. You can have a look at this. It's basically these are standard assumptions for the regression discontinuity design. You see here all the McCrary tests, they work because basically there is no discontinuity at the cutoff. So the cutoff in this case, on the right, you have municipalities that voted, that have a female mayor, and on the right, a male mayor, and basically they are continuous. We also have to check that the covariates are yes, then I also later I just put it here because sorry. Then we also have to check that all the covariates are continuous at the cutoff before, during, and after COVID. So basically, we need to check that that it is true that the gender of the mayor is random. So municipalities with a male and a female have exactly the same characteristics. And therefore, let me move faster because these are just checks that are very usual in the literature. But now it doesn't work. You did something and now it doesn't work. Okay, but I can do here. Okay, so this is the main result in terms of graphical inspection, okay? So this is 0 is our margin. On the right, you have municipalities with a female mayor, and on the left, you have those with a male mayor. And you see here the share of childcare expenditure before the COVID and during COVID. And you see basically that there is a big jump at 0 before the COVID, and this is exactly what we had in the previous figure, but with the RDD. So looking only at those that have gender mixed close races. Basically, there is a jump. It means that women spend more than men in childcare before the COVID. The jump disappears when I look at what happens during COVID. The jump disappears at 0, so there is continuity. You have the confidence interval that basically overlap, while here they do not. And basically, it means that during COVID, that there is the difference disappears. It is exactly what I expected, but it's not usual to have these big jumps in this type of analysis. So it means that there is something, okay? So that we have found some causal impact. Here, the left panel is exactly the same. So this is before, and this is post-COVID. And post-COVID, again, it's interesting because the jump, which disappeared during COVID, disappeared also post-COVID. So basically, this effect seems to be persistent, at least for the years that we have so far. So the effect is not temporary. The effect seems to be persistent, okay? So women were spending more than men in terms of childcare, substantive representation, style, leadership, agenda, very different. And then there is an emergency, so everybody realized that COVID is important. In particular, the childcare is important during COVID, and therefore men start spending more, and this remains also after the COVID, which is basically the story that we are trying to communicate. Okay. From now on, this is simply, simple econometrics. So basically, these are the regressions that correspond to the pictures that I showed you before. What are the regressions? We are, instead of having a simple RDD, as in the graphical inspections, here we basically estimate a difference in discontinuities, so that we can really take into account the characteristics of the different municipalities. And basically, our dependent variable is the shares of spending of childcare. And on the right, we have female, which is a dummy for a female mayor. We have COVID, which is a dummy for the COVID years. And we have the interaction between female and COVID, which is what we are interested. And then we have the difference in discontinuity estimator, which is delta, that is what happened during COVID compared to what happened before COVID at the difference between men and women. So delta is the coefficient of interest that we are interested in. And this is what we have in this table. So in this table, you see that female coefficient is positive, and this is exactly what we said before, because women spend more than men in childcare before COVID. So this can be seen by the coefficient here, which is positive and significant in all specification. The different specification refers to the different bandwidth, so how close we look at the margin of victory of women versus men. The COVID coefficient is also positive in specification 2 and 3, which means that male majors increase support for childcare over time, and the COVID times female is negative, which means that women decrease with respect to men, which is what we also have seen in our previous graph. Okay, so male majors increase their share of spending, female majors start to decrease their share of spending, but this reduction is not significant. We can do a lot of robustness checks, but basically the main question is not the robustness checks. We do all the things that the usual referees ask you to do when you have this type of analysis, but the question is why? What is going on? What is happening? Is our substantial representation in decision-making position different with respect when there is a crisis, when there is a more important problem? So what we do, we try to investigate a little bit more the mechanism. So with the hit of the pandemic, gender gap in spending in childcare is closed. Why is that? What's going on? What has happened? Probably, so we try first of all to see whether the result is driven by major electing during the pandemic. And so it's a kind of an electoral incentive. And this seems not to be the case, because even if we remove the elections that happened exactly in this time, the things remain the same. So it is really that males started to support childcare, probably because voters wanted more childcare, because it became more salient. Why became more salient? Because people were at home, schools were closed. So we really care about what happens to our children during this period, much more than before. So what we try to see is, this is for the elected and not re-elected, but I don't want to. Okay. What we try to see, which is interesting, is whether this current spending, the change that we observed in terms of current spending, is somehow related to working from home, which is a proxy. We know we have information at local level about how much people were working from home. So because during the pandemic, that was something that happened, of course, as we know. So we have this indicator at the municipal level in terms of working from home. And basically, we would like to understand whether the change that we observed is driven by municipalities that have more working from home with respect to the others, because this is in line with the idea that childcare becomes important if you work from home at distance. So here you see that basically it is pretty much the case that our COVID times female coefficient is more significant in this type of specifications, and also female and COVID. So the results come from above the median rather than below the median. We are still working on this in order to have a little bit more precise specification, but we have like an intuition that the story that we are trying to understand, so whether the circumstances, the context, in this case the crisis, matters for the results that we observe, is because people react to what's going on, in this case to remote working. Okay, so leaders' action aligned in times of crisis. Childcare became more important to voters and therefore also to politicians that decided to spend more, also the male politician. So what happens after? This is another, after is another story, because we know the preferences are sticky also because of culture. So if you prefer to spend into childcare, this is not going to change very easily. So we have this the story of the sticky preferences, but we also have the story that the COVID made salient the crucial role of caregivers, and so this spending may become a little bit more inertia. As I told you before, so basically we do exactly the same thing, but now we look at the difference in discontinuity estimator of female versus male after COVID with respect to before. One may also want to compare during with after. We decided to compare before, the period before with the period during COVID, and the period before with the period after, just because the period after looks very much similar to the period during COVID. So it's exactly the same thing, and we have similar results here. Again, female is positive and significant. So before COVID, the women were spending more, but post-COVID, it's also positive. So everybody is spending more after COVID in childcare. But the interaction between post and female is negative. So it's male that are driven this increase of spending into childcare in the post-COVID. So everybody's spending more, even women, and this is in line with the idea that this has become a more salient issue. But basically, the result is driven by women. Okay. So basically, this is the story. This is just one example, let's say, in my view. This is one example to show you that substantive representation matters and that leadership matters. So when we have men and women in leadership position, they may produce different results. In this specific case, the implementation of school closure, part of the lockdown measure, placed a great burden on the household, in particular on women. And we know from other studies that although men also did something more than women during the more than usual during the pandemic in terms of childcare, in terms of housework, etc., much of the burden remained on women. So because of gender culture, because of gender norms. So this means that childcare became particularly relevant, and therefore male politicians start to, in order to be closer to preferences of individuals and voters that realize that childcare is very important, they start spending on childcare more during the recovery period. And this is nice because basically something that was considered the female priority for whatever reason, because childcare is not something for women, it's something for children. But we know that in our societies that are characterized by gender roles and gender norms, women typically take care of children. Therefore, childcare is considered a female priority, and then became a common goal for everybody. So I think, okay, no, this I save you from the appendix, and thank you very much.
No sé si alguien tiene alguna. Sí.
Uh, Thank you, Paola, for your congratulations for your presentation and for your approach on this theme about gender around the world. My question, let me put a very short introduction, which is the reality in the European Union. What do I think? The European Union is outdated. The system is outdated. Bureaucracy. But in the field, there are many things that doesn't work. One of them is the different gender conditions. Instead of an European policy for child care benefits, for maternity benefits, why not to think really about the birth rate? The birth rate. That's our problem in the long run. Why? That European Commission didn't do anything sustainable anything in the past. But for the future, we have the immigrants, or if you want, the migrations. But we have to think in the long run. And for the long run, why not? What do you think about this case? Why not substitute the benefits, the childhood benefits, for a salary for women during 6 years? Why 6 years? Because children go to school more or less around 6 years old. The mother, I have to say that the mothers have to educate and be present during the childhood, during 6 years, but paid by each state a salary that woman, this is the opportunity cost. If the women are not employed, the salary should be paid by each state during 6 years. Well, you can think, well, it's too much time. I don't think so. Because we don't want to create monsters for the future. What do you think to substitute, instead of childhood care or benefits, instead of that, to pay to the mothers during 6 years a salary completely free tax, if you want, instead of the actual policies that the European Union is practicing nowadays.
You are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Basically, you're saying that mothers have to stay at home for 6 years and care for their children. I disagree.
That's it.
I disagree. I really disagree with
the
this.
education starts at home.
Yeah,
at home, in the family, with the mothers.
No, also with the father.
No. Well, I'm not shooting the fathers. I'm not shooting the fathers. The fathers are important as well, but
yes.
No, the mothers are more important. More important. Sorry, I don't agree. The mothers are more important.
I know I would never put women at home for 6 years. First of all, because it means to destroy their career, of course, because after, there are no evidence that suggests that if women stay at home so long, children are better. There is no clear evidence. So basically, children, what they need is a good childcare, high quality childcare. They have to spend time, quality, with both mothers and fathers. So there is no evidence to say that when women stay at home for 6 years, children are better. this is, I don't know, I mean, if you know some reference, but this is not, there is no evidence in that direction. And then also this is not equality in the sense that if we want more women in the labor market, and because this is important for growth, for development, for GDP, for whatever, we cannot give them money to stay at home and do nothing, because basically it means that their career will never will never be equal to the ones of men. So I disagree with this. Of course, it can be a proposal, but it's too long. Actually, we also know that even the maternity leaves, the literature agrees on the fact that even the maternity leaves cannot be too long. I mean, the maternity leave is important to allow women to participate to the labor market, etc. So maternity leave is important, but there is a kind of optimal duration of the maternity leave, maximum 1 year, after which it goes down. It becomes to be negative for women. If we know, and maternity leave basically in countries where there are generous maternity leaves, it means that this is a period fully paid to stay with your child. So it's very similar to your, let's say, to your idea. But the literature agrees that there is a kind of maximum amount, maximum 1 year, after which the benefits are going to be reduced, because it's kind of hump shaped. So So basically, that would be very similar. I think what is particularly interesting is to have both men and women treated equally in terms of leaves and in terms of period that they have to spend with children. For example, we have done another study where we have seen that where men and women that spend more balanced time with their children in terms of childcare, domestic activities, all these things, in time T, after 3 years, same people interviewed, the same people with the same, exactly the same people. After 3 years, these couples that were balancing better their time within the couple, they had a higher probability to have another child and to have the woman working full time, which means that actually equal participation at home in terms of childcare, housework activities, etc., is an essential part for gender equality later on. So basically, gender equality starts at home. Also, because from the demand side, that would be very bad. Imagine a firm that knows that the woman disappears for 6 years. Nobody will hire a woman. So that's the typical statistical discrimination story. Firms will never hire women if they...
Me parece muy bien, pero la penalización...
No, de acuerdo, Loren. But I agree with that. But Paola and Lauren.
And also, I think that you don't have to, we cannot do the mistake of saying that children are more important than female employment. Let's say these two things are not in trade-off. Countries that have higher fertility rates have more women at work. So in our nowadays, that was true in the past. In the past, it was true. I mean, if you had high female employment rate, you had low fertility rate. That's not true in the current time.
Well, my intervention was the post-COVID-19. Okay, the situation now is completely different from years ago. But when I put you the question, was not to create penalties for women or even the fathers that want to stay at home, for example, during 6 years. This is a decision between the couple, if you want.
Ahora sí, perdón. Bueno, Paola, felicitarte por el trabajo que habéis hecho. Me parece muy sugerente esta idea de trascender e ir más allá de la representación descriptiva, es decir, de contar cuántos hombres y cuántas mujeres hay en los puestos de liderazgo o en los puestos de lo que sea, y empezar a hacer este asunto de la representación sustancial. A mí me ha resultado muy novedoso, no conocía este enfoque. Es decir, qué hacen y qué deciden las mujeres cuando están en determinados puestos, que es lo que nos interesa, claro. No nos interesa que haya muchas mujeres que luego decidan cosas que no nos interesan, ¿no? Entonces, claro, me surge aquí mucho la idea de, claro, todo esto va a estar muy influenciado por cuáles son los valores predominantes. Entonces, claro, tal y como está evolucionando la política en nuestras sociedades, no va a ser suficiente con que más y más mujeres alcancen puestos de liderazgo para que la igualdad, para que avancemos hacia la igualdad. Me preocupa mucho esto y bueno, os felicito simplemente por esta forma de enfocar y me parece enormemente sugerente.
Muchas gracias porque eso es verdad. Nosotros también lo que hemos visto, por ejemplo, en otro trabajo que tengo, estamos mirando si esta forma de, digamos, de substantial representation, si esta representación substancial, digamos, cambia cuando depende de la ideología de política de hombres y mujeres. Y por supuesto, ahora tenemos solamente como preliminary results, pero es muy importante la ideología. Porque, por ejemplo, por algunas ideologías prácticamente desaparece el efecto de tener hombre o mujer en representante. Es muy interesante porque tenemos datos en que se ve cómo contestan a algunos asuntos que se refieren a redistribución, a gender arrangement y a otras cosas, o sea, a preguntas sobre las políticas públicas y cómo contestan los ciudadanos de un país y cómo contestan los políticos, porque es la misma cosa. Y se ve que los ciudadanos claramente lo que importa si es el género y es la ideología. Los políticos ya no, la ideología es dominante, casi siempre. Así que es muy interesante porque es exactamente eso que nosotros tenemos que mirar también. Depende de cuál es el resultado, pero no podemos simplemente mirar si hay un hombre o una mujer, porque depende de lo que hacen, y la ideología puede ser algo. O sea, que todo eso de identity politics, que se habla muchísimo, la verdad es que tenemos que tenerlo un poco controlado, digamos, en tema de mujeres, porque si no es un pinkwashing.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Gracias, Paola, por la conferencia, muy interesante. No, mi pregunta es una mera curiosidad. Es una diapositiva que ha pasado un poco rápido y me gustaría verla. Eran los test de robustez que haces.
Ah, sí. Sí, lo he pasado rápido porque es bastante...
Sí, no te has entretenido en ella, simplemente...
Es un poco pesado, pero sí, ya voy. ¿Dónde están estos? Sí, a ver. Pues el primero, robust second order polynomial regression. Because when you have regression discontinuity design, of course, you have to take a different approximation of the polynomial to see to define the bandwidth. Okay, you have to define the bandwidth. How close is close race? Close race means approximation with the first order polynomial, second order polynomial, and we do also the second. Then we have regional fixed effect. This is also something quite standard. Then we have trends with RDD coefficients, because, as I said before, that was not RDD. That was discontinuity, difference in discontinuities. Then we did it by dropping 1 year at a time, because it may be that one year is particularly significant and the other not. And then we have the story of the balanced data set, as I told you, because we have some, because the elections happen in different times in different municipalities, so we may have an unbalanced data set. We kept the unbalanced in the main specifications because it's larger, so we have more municipalities, but we also tried to restrict to the balanced. So this is what we did. And we can also see the results, but they're very similar also when you try to do it, let's say, more with a smaller sample.
Nosotros hemos pasado de 2 días...
¿Es obligatorio? No lo cogen. No, en Italia no lo cogen. Sí, está retribuido al 100%.
Pero nosotros hemos pasado de 2 días, en el año 2007, 2 días, que realmente lo que teníamos era 2 días para ir al registro civil y ya está.
Sí.
Luego pasamos a 15 días y pasaba lo mismo. Con 15 días había muchos trabajadores que no lo cogían, en parte también porque estaba como mal visto dentro
Exacto,
de
está mal
empresa.
visto en la empresa, esto es lo que te
Pero
digo,
ahora hemos roto ya esa barrera.
Claro, porque ya si todo el mundo lo coge, lo van a coger, claro, es paritario. En Italia no, porque está mal visto en la empresa, porque dice, este tío no es committed to the work, y la gente no lo coge, solo son 10 días, pero es obligatorio además, pero no lo cogen, porque sí, es obligatorio, pero si no lo coges no te pasa nada, que tampoco... No se lo pueden pasar, es exclusivo. No, está bien hecho, pero solo son 10 días. Está bien construido, no lo pueden pasar, pero no lo cogen. Es como un 20% o algo así.
Yo quería hacer otra pregunta porque eres experta también en temas de liderazgo femenino. Entonces, uno de los temas que también se estaba debatiendo aquí es sobre la imposición de cuotas en consejos de administración. La pregunta es, igual que en ese experimento tuyo, ¿has visto que cuando desaparecen los estereotipos empezamos a comportarnos igual? Cuando la mujer se incorpora a las cuotas, a los consejos, ¿se empieza a comportar como los
hombre.
varones?
Bueno,
¿O no?
Eso es difícil de medir porque no lo sabemos, pero o sea, allí hay un tema de critical mass. O sea, que las cuotas siempre es como... Nosotros, por ejemplo, teníamos cuotas un poco gradual. Al principio era 20%, luego 33% y luego 40%. Y entonces, cuando son más, pueden tener su propia... O sea, no tienen que conformarse a los hombres. Porque, claro, eso tampoco está bien. Sí, hay más mujeres, pero son iguales que los hombres. Luego la substantial representation ya no hay, porque son prácticamente iguales. Pero nosotros hemos visto que si hay una critical mass... Porque el 20% significaba, normalmente estos consejos son 10 personas, ¿no? Entonces, una mujer o 2 mujeres en 10, prácticamente no hay mucho cambio. Pero cuando empiezan a ser 3 o 4, pues entonces cambia un poco, por lo menos. Esto, hay un critical mass que es bastante necesario. Pero, porque si no, una sola, sí. La idea es un poco esta, que cuando hay una situación male-dominated y entonces todos los estereotipos y todo esto, una mujer que llega allí prácticamente no lo ves, porque hace como los hombres. Pero si empiezan a hacer un poco más, puede hacer un cambio. Pero eso hay que mirarlo bien.
Yo solo iba a intervenir para felicitarte por tu brillante exposición, pero bueno, nosotros ahora acabamos de hacer un paper sobre el papel de la mujer en los consejos de administración y cómo eso influye en la tendencia a que la empresa tenga edificios verdes y estas cosas, ¿no? Y bueno, en la revisión literaria encontré un paper que está citado en todos los sitios, pero desgraciadamente ahora mismo no sé de quién era, en el que decían que en Europa, por haber cuotas, bueno, la mujer no tendría a comportarse como el hombre. Bueno, estaban hablando de las empresas listadas en el Eurostock 300, pero en Estados Unidos sí, en las empresas listadas en el S&P 500, ahí las mujeres, como emulando el patrón de éxito de los varones, para tener éxito tendrían a comportarse como los varones. Pero sí me acuerdo, no recuerdo ahora mismo, que lo paso de todas maneras, sino. Y después, una cosa que sí que hemos encontrado nosotros en este tipo de papers es que en vez de buscar el efecto de la mujer en el Consejo de Administración, bueno, habría que hablar casi más de función de efectos, ¿no? Porque parece que el efecto va cambiando en función de los resultados, ¿no? De la aparición de la mujer en los consejos de administración. Cambian, son unos porcentajes el 20%, otros es el 25%, otros es el... Y es muy curiosa, ¿no? Ver que esa evolución. En nuestro caso, a lo mejor en otros no, pero probablemente sí, probablemente no haya un efecto constante, como no lo hay en casi ninguna cosa, ¿no? Y tiene que ser curioso en el caso de la participación de la mujer en los consejos de administración y los resultados que obtengan, ¿no?
Sí, sí, eso es muy interesante, claro, se puede ver por muchas partes.
Yo quería hablar justamente lo que ha dicho nuestro presidente, que era muy escéptico en el tema de las mujeres, no creía nada, decía que las relaciones eran espurias, pero a raíz del trabajo que hemos hecho, no solamente ya cree, sino que además está entusiasmado y tiene intención de seguir trabajando en el tema.
Muy bien, muy bien. Porque,
O sea que-
claro, al final la evidencia empírica siempre motiva, ¿no?
Sí. Y,
Es fuerte.
Y bueno, lo que él ha comentado es justamente lo que yo iba a decir, ¿no? Esa es una explicación que di yo basándome en literatura, ¿no? En diferentes literaturas, intenté justificar el porqué de las diferencias, porque a mí me gusta cuando hacemos estudios, y yo tengo ya varios estudios hechos donde me gusta comparar el mercado europeo y el mercado americano, ¿no? Precisamente porque muchos estudios se hacen a nivel de CSR, ¿no? Y aquí en Europa somos mucho más restrictivos en normas medioambientales, pero también hay diferencias, evidentemente, en la legislación de cuotas. Ese es un paper que tengo yo publicado en Frontier in Psychology, donde estudio la relación entre el porcentaje de la mujer en el Consejo de Administración y la volatilidad de la acción en el mercado, el riesgo de mercado, sí. Y bueno, yo intenté justificar esas diferencias basándome en eso, justamente lo que iba a comentar.
Eso es
Sí.
interesante, sí,
Sí, pero bueno, se ha metido de una forma que está encantado y además tiene ganas de seguir, ya tiene idea de seguir con cosas que, como además tiene conocimientos estadísticos que yo no tengo, pues de meter metodología y cosas bastante novedosas que no se aplican en este tipo de estudios y que pueden ser muy interesantes.
Sí, exacto, porque muchas veces, por lo menos antes de las cuotas y de todo eso, la gente hacía como correlación o hablaba de esto, pero la verdad es que hay que sacar datos.
Yo, en mi defensa, tengo que decir, nunca había estudiado el tema, pero es que en mi cabeza no cabe que haya gente que pueda discriminar por sexo. Y yo he tenido la fortuna de que en mi vida no lo he visto, quizá por el mundo en el que me mueva, ¿no? Entonces sí que era escéptico, pero bueno, luego cuando vas a la evidencia empírica y ves un montón de empresas y un montón de datos, pues hay lo que hay, claro, es verdad.
Sí, sí que hay.
No sé si hay alguna pregunta más. Hola. Pues simplemente darte las gracias otra vez, Paola. Ha sido un placer. Muy bien.